The PS1 heralded the dawning of a ton of successful franchises that are still going strong today as some of the biggest in the industry, but also saw a bunch of sequels for its pretty beloved games that nobody has ever heard of, or at least can remember. It's enough to leave you pretty jaded. The original Jade Cocoon on PS1 carved out a pretty specific niche. You see, it wasn't the most mechanically deep RPG of its era, but it stood out through atmosphere and cool minion mechanics. Not those. You had muted colours, a melancholy tone, and monster designs overseen by Studio Ghibli alumni that gave it an identity no other late 90s RPG quite matched. Reviews tended to praise its world building and creature fusion system while noting that the combat and pacing were fairly basic. Arguably, it didn't belong in the top 10 RPGs on the PS1, but it wasn't far off either. Interestingly published by Ubisoft in the West, Jade Cocoon 2 arrived on PS2 and immediately felt like an all-or-nothing pivot, and people basically gave it nothing in return. Visually, it's brighter, more colourful, and far more animated, with hundreds of cutscenes, but it does also lack that Ghibli touch. Mechanically, it is more system heavy, as monster battles play out in arenas, fusion is expanded, and progression is far more explicit and video gamey. More of everything equals more love though, right? Well, reception, however, flipped in an interesting way. Where the first game was forgiven for its simplicity because of its mood as such, Jade Cocoon 2 was often criticised for losing that atmosphere without fully replacing it with depth. Many outlets described it as competent and decent but unremarkable, praising the technical improvements while lamenting that it felt closer to a standard PS2 RPG than a continuation of something special from the PS1. It reviewed about as well as the original game, but had pretty much no impact. It is not a bad game, don't make a mistake, but it didn't have the same source as the original, and it's pretty much completely forgotten now. Right, can I ask you something? Remember this one? Well, you probably will if you watched our Forgotten Survival Horror Games video. It's pretty good. All 7 billion other potential viewers that didn't, you're in for a ride. The original Galarians on PS1 is best remembered for the sheer commitment to its own strange energy. It mixed survival horror with anime body horror, psychic powers, and a headache-inducing reliance on pills to stop your brain from literally exploding. Imagine Akira, right, but a good bit wetter, you'd say, quite wet as games go. Some critics admired how different it felt from Resident Evil clones, others found it stiff, awkward, and borderline just a pain in the arse to play. Sales were modest, but it did garner itself a small cult reputation. Galarian's Ash took that cult curiosity and dragged it into the PS2 era, but not without sanding down a few edges. Psychic powers are still the pull here, psychic, telekinesis, whatever, but combat is more direct with less emphasis on careful resource juggling and more on spectacle, and it doesn't quite work. It is more detailed but also far more conventional. You know, the grimy, claustrophobic feel of the original game is a lot sleeker, kind of to its detriment here. While the first game was criticised for being clumsy but praised for its originality, Ash did not get as much patience. Reviews noted that it played better moment to moment for a lot of them, but had lost some of the unsettling identity that made Galarian stand out in the first place, but also that it didn't really feel like a generational leap from the PS1. Also, way too many cutscenes, but at least it had a pretty cool breakcore soundtrack. As you might be able to tell from it being in this video, sales were much worse than for the original, but we did get some sick cover art and a forgotten anime film too. It was also a bit crap, but whatever. Galarian's Ash isn't a terrible game as such, but it simply lacked a gritty spark as the PS2 exploded into life. It also didn't help that it came out 2 years after Silent Hill 2. You would be a big sill to say it gets anywhere near that one, really. The original Valkyrie Profile on PS1 is a game people talk about as if it saved their life. A side-scrolling RPG built around Norse mythology, existential tragedy, and a combat system that felt completely bespoke. It reviewed extremely well at the time and only grew in stature as copies became harder to find, even as it received a pretty brilliant version on the PSP. Valkyrie Profile 2 Thulmeria is where things get maybe slightly daft. Instead of following up directly, Tri-Ace essentially rebooted the format while keeping the name and setting events before the first game. The sequel shifts to a, prequel? maybe, shifts to a fully 3D presentation with cinematic camera work, sprawling environments, and a combat system that's deeper, flashier, and far more technically demanding. Compared to a lot of the games we'll talk about today, it is an impressive PS2 game in a very literal sense, and you could say it's pretty broadly underrated as well. Critically, Silmeria was received well, but differently. Reviews tended to praise its combat depth, visual ambition, and sheer scope, while also flagging pacing issues, long dungeons, and a story that takes a long time to properly get going. Compared to the PS1 original's almost universal critical acclaim, the sequel reviewed strongly no doubt, but with a bit less generational reverence. Valkyrie Profile 2 is denser, more demanding, and arguably less essential, but also bolder in ways few PS2 RPGs dare to be. Again, it's not as good as the first game, and arguably isn't a bona fide classic, but if you've been putting off playing it, it is definitely worth a look. Also, I'm looking forward to putting Valkyrie Elysium in a similar video in a few years. Anybody remember that one? Well, hard to imagine. The original Die Hard trilogy is remembered as a moment in time when the video game industry decided to offer amazing value. That one single time, 30 years ago. A licensed PS1 release that somehow bundled three completely different genres into one package. It was an absolute riot that you or at least one of your mates would play when you were a bit too young. You're getting a shooter, a light gun style on rails section, and a driving game in one box, even if none of them were especially refined. Its reputation has only grown stronger with age, and it's still probably the best Die Hard game of all time. Die Hard Trilogy 2 Viva Las Vegas, which, as you guessed, yes, takes place in Dagenham, takes a very different approach by instantly making its name meaningless. Rather than doubling down on the multi-film insanity, the sequel stripped things back into being based around a single original storyline based in Vegas. So shouldn't it be Die Hard single? Isn't that what most Newcastle United fans do anyway? Reviews were noticeably harsher, criticising stiff controls, awkward camera work, and a general sense that the game felt dated even by late generation PS1 standards. But the first game got a pass for being messy but inventive, Die Hard Trilogy 2 was judged as a straightforward action game and found to be just a bit too bland. Developers N-Space would learn from their mistakes here and go on to make Geist and Gillian Michaels' fitness adventure? But Die Hard Trilogy 2 is not offensively bad, but it's as forgettable as that Die Hard movie with Jai Courtney in. Yeah, exactly. Here's something slightly different to what we've looked at so far. More people probably know developer Saknoth for Shadow Hearts than Kudelka, but a lot of people probably don't know that they're also connected. That's not surprising, as Kudelka on PS1 is a strange starting point for anything resembling a franchise. It's a slow gothic hybrid of survival horror and RPG set almost entirely inside a Welsh monastery, Cymru am Byth, with a heavy emphasis on atmosphere and voice acting, which was some of the best of all time back in 1999. Reviews praised its tone, soundtrack, and ambition while openly questioning the clunky combat system and uneven pacing. It reviewed decently rather than spectacularly, but its user reviews really tell the full story. Shadow Hearts is technically its sequel, but you'd be forgiven for never realising. It drops the Kudelka name entirely, jumps to PS2, and retools almost everything. The combat system becomes faster and more expressive thanks to the Judgment Ring mechanic, the scope expands dramatically, and the tone shifts to still weird, still dark, but far more willing to be playful and quite theatrical. Where Kudelka was seen as an interesting but kind of sometimes awkward experiment, Shadow Hearts was widely praised as a confident, distinct RPG. Reviews highlighted its originality, combat system, and willingness to lean into horror themes without becoming a bit too much. Scores were notably higher, and for many players it felt like a breakout success rather than a continuation of something niche. Its sequel, Shadow Hearts Covenant, is frequently held up as one of the best RPGs on the entire PlayStation 2, praised for refining the combat, sharpening the writing, and fully committing to the series' strange tonal balance in brilliant ways. And then they went and fracked it up completely. Alright, let's go. This one was a surprise to me. The original G-Police on PS1 was already pushing the console to somewhere near its limits. Set in a sprawling futuristic city with full 3D environments and long-ass draw distances, it was ambitious to say the least. Critics at the time largely admired what it was trying to do with the sense of scale, the dense urban layout, and the attempt at something more simulation-leaning than most console action games. But it did obviously have a few performance issues. It didn't stop it from being like one step above a cult hit, but not quite a mainstream banger, like a Streets Won't Forget game. G-Police Weapons of Justice doesn't so much fix those problems as double down on them. It's bigger, more complex, and far more demanding. Missions are longer, objectives more layered, and even has like 25 different weapons and over 30 enemies to fight. It refines the flight model and expands the arsenal, but it also asks even more of the PS1 hardware. Critics generally agreed that G-Police 2 was the better designed game, praising its deeper missions and stronger structure. However, it did also have quite a lot of negativity for performance and for just making things quite complicated while also being pretty short somehow. The sequel was judged more harshly for its rough edges, especially as players' expectations rose near the end of the PS1's life cycle, and the word of mouth just wasn't as strong, and you don't really hear much about this one. There was no third game, and no real attempt to carry the idea onto the PlayStation 2, and no real closure either, which is a shame. Within a few years, Psygnosis was fully absorbed into Sony, rebranded as Studio Liverpool, and redirected towards faster, more commercially viable projects like Wipeout Fusion and Formula 1. But they had one other forgotten PS1 sequel up their sleeves before then. Seriously, guys, video on just how crazy Psygnosis went back in the day, you want that? It could be fun. The original Roll Cage landed on PS1 with a very clear hook, and that was going very fast upside down. It was futuristic racing where your car could drive on walls, ceilings, and anything else that vaguely counted as a surface. It was fast, aggressive, and technically very impressive indeed, but it also felt slightly rough around the edges. Reviewers at the time were generally positive, praising the sense of speed and originality, while pointing out awkward physics quirks, a steep learning curve, and AI that could feel a bit mental, but it was the game that's legacy is arguably carried by its banger demo alone. Everyone remembers that demo. Roll Cage Stage 2 is a textbook example of a sequel that fixes almost everything, but nobody cares. Americans, if this is ringing zero bells, it was actually renamed Death Track Racing for you over there, and it was published by Take-Two, later of GTA fame. The handling is tighter here, the tracks are more readable, and the sense of momentum is better balanced. It adds more modes, more cars, and more ways to weaponize speed without fundamentally changing what made the original game so damn fun. Crucially, it also feels less like a tech experiment, and more like a fully realised racing game. Where Roll Cage was praised for ideas, Stage 2 was praised for execution. But the problem was timing. Released right at the tail end of the PS1's life in March 2000, it arrived as attention was already shifting towards the PS2, and there were a lot of racing games on PS1 at that point, and it didn't quite stand out enough. If you want more of this kind of thing, several members of the Roll Cage development team later formed Atom Punk and went on to create Grip Combat Racing, which was basically a Roll Cage 3. Brave Fencer Musashi on PS1 is remembered as a sadly often overlooked action RPG whip-up. It's stuffed with voice acting and built around a day-night system that directly affected towns, dungeons, and enemy behaviour. Absolutely crazy stuff at the time, and it garnered plenty of fans. Yeah, it wasn't a blockbuster, but it was distinctive enough to carve out a loyal following that still talks about it very fondly when you bring up PS1 hidden gems. Musashi Samurai Legend for the PS2 is technically the sequel, but it makes almost no effort to feel like one. The tone is darker, more serious, and far less whimsical.
Which was the style at the time.
Structurally, it ditches the time management ideas almost entirely and pivots towards a more conventional action RPG format with linear progression, combo-heavy combat, and a heavier emphasis on spectacle. It even has character designs from Tetsuya Nomura, which should be obvious from the cover alone. While Samurai Legend wasn't savaged by critics as such, it reviewed more modestly than the PS1 original. Reviews often praised the production values and combat ambition, but criticised the repetitive encounters, thinner personality, and loss of the systems that made Brave Fencer Musashi feel so unique, while also it just mashed too many genres too much. Where the first game was remembered as quirky and surprising, the sequel was seen as competent but interchangeable really. It just did not possess that mythical source, and it really did not sell very well, and the series died here. Neither game has been ported to anything since. Basically, people didn't want Musashi to grow up as such, they just wanted it to stay strange. By chasing a more mainstream action RPG identity, Samurai Legend lost that source and is now most notable for having hairstyles that would make even Seymour wince. Published at the tail end of Sony realising that, hey, people sure do like this Final Fantasy stuff, The Legend of Legaia on PS1 earned its reputation by doing something really quite cool. You see, its turn-based combat used directional inputs to create long custom attack strings, giving fights a feel closer to a fighting rhythm game than a traditional JRPG. Critics and players responded well at the time, praising how distinct the system felt and how effectively it broke up the usual menu-driven flow that could sometimes plague RPGs. The story and presentation were considered solid rather than spectacular, but the amazing combat alone was enough to give the game lasting cult appeal. Legaia 2 Dual Saga arrived early on the PS1 in 2001 with a clear mandate: make it bigger, faster, and more accessible. The core art system does return, but it's streamlined and simplified with fewer restrictions and more emphasis on chaining flashy attacks. Dual Saga is obviously also a visual step up, with brighter environments, cleaner character models, and a more traditional heroic fantasy tone. Structurally though, it feels a lot more straightforward, maybe too straightforward. While Dual Saga was generally well received, it rarely inspired the same enthusiasm as the PS1 game. Reviews often described it as competent and enjoyable, but not really an essential play. The combat was still praised, yet some critics felt it had lost a bit of its personality. It's also worth remembering that it didn't come to the West until after Final Fantasy X had already been out for a year. Yeah, clear winner there. Sales were of course quite poor, and there was no third game. That disappearance also lines up with a broader shift at Sony though. After the PS1 era, Sony published far fewer traditional JRPGs, increasingly focusing its internal output on action, racing, and western-leaning prestige titles instead. We never even got a sequel to The Legend of Dragoon. Tobal mistake there. Tobal number 1 on PS1 is largely remembered for a reason that has almost nothing to do with Tobal itself. In the West, its legacy is kind of inseparable from the Final Fantasy VII demo that was bundled in the box, which is a shame as the fighting game itself is quite decent. It's basically the Zone of the Enders of the PS1, which itself came with an MGS2 disc. I played the hell out of that. Critics at the time were polite but lukewarm when it came to Tobal. The animation and character designs by Akira Toriyama were praised, but the combat was often described as stiff, undercooked, and lacking the depth needed to compete with established 3D fighters. It reviewed modestly well, but just really struggled against Tekken and the like. Tobal 2 is where the story takes a sharp turn, mostly because almost nobody outside of Japan played it. Released exclusively in Japan, the sequel dramatically expands the combat system, adds a massive roster, and introduces a full-fledged quest mode that blends fighting mechanics with RPG-style progression and exploration. What you can catch in this mode actually unlocks them as characters in Versus mode. You can even catch a chocobo and use it as a fighter. Tobal 2 is actually a much better, more complete game, addressing nearly every complaint levelled at the first game. It's the version people wanted Tobal number 1 to be in the first place. Compared to the original's middling response, Tobal 2 was widely seen as a genuine improvement, and in some circles, one of Square's best PS1 games. It still never officially made its way over here, but fan translations have been knocking around for about 20 years now. Matey. Outro gang, those were just some forgotten sequels to PS1 games, and of course I've probably forgotten others. Do you have any others to suggest? Be sure to let me know down below, and we might make a second video. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures. It's been good to have you, and I'll catch you when I catch you.